on Victory in Europe Day in May of 1945, or in Hanoi, where Ho Chi Minh issued a Declaration of Independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam on the very day that Japan's formal surrender was taking place in Tokyo Bay on September the 2nd. And of course, in New Glasgow, Canada, where Viola Desmond challenged the indignities of racial segregation on November 8, 1946, part, again, of a worldwide pushback against global white supremacy at this time. And as important as it was, Van Dine itself was not exceptional within its own year of 1945 when it took place, which was also, of course, the year of the bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama, and of the African National Congress's remarkable Freedom Charter, adopted at the Congress of the People in Kliptown, South Africa. So the Bandung Conference, then, was also part of an international movement of movements against global white supremacy. Okay, so what can we learn from Malcolm X's internationalist analysis of race in the 21st century? Quite a lot, I would argue. Just as Malcolm X made connections between Bandung-era decolonization and the Black freedom struggle in the United States, we might make links between popular opposition to war, contemporary resistance against settler colonialism, revolt against the structurally inevitable inequalities of capitalism, and contemporary contestations of racialized police brutality. Because each of these movements are aspects of the struggle against empire. This is not to say that the great movements of our times neatly align, or that there are no tensions or contradictions between them, but they are connected, as are the structures of power arrayed against them. And no one, until half a century ago, this very day, articulated this relationship more clearly and more eloquently than Malcolm X. Thanks.
Now Dr. Saney is going to talk to us about Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, the false divide.
First, I'd like to say it's a pleasure to be here. When we conceived, Dr. Upat and I conceived of marking the 50th anniversary of Malcolm X's assassination, we thought it was important to actually host it here in the North Branch Library, precisely because of the historic role of the North Branch Library in Black Nova Scotian history. My presentation will, in many cases, overlap with what John said, and then I will go into my reflections on the relationship between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. As a revolutionary internationalist, As a revolutionary internationalist and as a leader of the Black liberation struggle, Malcolm shaped and influenced a generation of Black activists, artists, revolutionaries, and intellectuals. His impact has been profound and lasting. The 50th anniversary of his assassination is therefore a time for serious contemplation on Malcolm X's legacy. While alive, Malcolm X faced an unrelenting vilification from the ruling circles. In death, the same forces that denounced him attempt to transform him into a benign symbol, palatable to imperialist and neoliberal palates. Now, he is now praised by those same powers that once condemned him. As Lenin noted in his seminal work, The State and Revolution, he noted, during the lifetime of great revolutionaries, the oppressing classes have invariably meted out to them relentless persecution and received their teaching with the most savage hostility, most furious hatred, and a ruthless campaign of lies and slanders. After the death, however, attempts are usually made to turn them into harmless saints, canonize them, as it were, and investing their name with a certain halo by way of consolation to the oppressed classes, and with the object of duping them, while at the same time emasculating and vulgarizing the real essence of the revolutionary theories and blunting the revolutionary edge. End of quote. So it is with Malcolm X. And I put up the autobiography here, which is a critical book in anyone's journey in terms of understanding Malcolm X, but often it serves as basically being the end point of anybody's in interrogation and encounter with X. They don't read his last speeches, as I will talk about, how his political development developed subsequently. And I would not recommend Spike Lee's movie for anyone who's interested in understanding Malcolm X's subsequent political and intellectual development. So it is with Malcolm X. While acknowledging his rupture with the most race essentialist and absurd theological and ideological tenets of the Nation of Islam, especially the white devil thesis, Malcolm X is crafted as a crude and unsophisticated ultra-national and black nationalist. This is in the kind of dominant popular discourse that ruling circles wish to impose. Moreover, the significance of his legacy is often reduced to a personal odyssey, an individualist ethos illustrating what someone can do by sheer force of will to transform their lives. The pervasive and dominant narrative freezes in place Malcolm's politics and philosophy, transfixing his thinking to the 12 years he served in the Nation of Islam when he was under the authority of its leader Elijah Muhammad. In this mangling of historical memory, the further development of his political and intellectual thinking from 1964 to 1965 disappears. In short, the subsequent development of his thinking on capitalism and imperialism I ignored. As Dr. Munro pointed out, Malcolm X was part and parcel of the wave of anti-colonial, national liberation, and anti-imperialist struggles that swept Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean after the Second World War. He did not adopt this outlook until after March 8, 1964, until after March, one could argue, did not really adopt this outlook or deepen this outlook and really expanded it until after his March 8, 1964 break with the Nation of Islam and the tutelage of Elijah Muhammad. He challenged US exceptionalism by clearly placing the African liberation movement within the global anti-colonial struggle, and also argued anti-capitalist struggle as well. He increasingly placed the black liberation struggle within an internationalist context. Indeed, he saw the internationalist perspective as indispensable to advancing the fight for justice in the United States. On February 4th, 1965, and I encourage people to, for example, get Malcolm X Speaks, or for example, Malcolm X The Last Speeches, or Malcolm X Speeches at Harvard. Malcolm X Speaks by George Whitman is a very excellent contribution, but as I was saying, oops, I lost my space. Okay. On February 4th, 1965, in his address to youth in Selma, Alabama, and I stress that depiction of Malcolm X and his encounter with Coretta Scott in the movie Selma is complete fiction. Okay, and we can talk about that because actually King and his supporters didn't want Malcolm X to speak then. Okay? And King actually in an article afterwards was saying he respected Malcolm X, said he did not want him to speak there because at that time, as we shall see, Martin Luther King had some very diametrically opposed views to the views that he was developed later on before his assassination in 1968. Views, as I will show, mirrored quite a bit of what Malcolm X actually stated. So in his address to youth in Selma, Alabama, Malcolm X stated, quote, "I pray that you will grow intellectually so that you can understand the problems of the world and where you fit into it in that world picture." On February 18, 1965, he went further, stating that the black liberation struggle was, quote, "part of the rebellion against the oppression and colonialism that has characterized this era." He further argued it's incorrect to classify the revolt of the Negro as simply a racial conflict of black against white or as purely an American problem. Rather, today we are seeing a global rebellion of the oppressed against the oppressor, the exploited against the exploiter. Malcolm X's repudiation of a race-only analysis was captured in a January 1965 television interview where he declared, and I quote, "I believe there will ultimately be a clash between the oppressed and those who do the oppressing. I believe that there will be a clash between those who want freedom, justice, and equality for everyone and those who want to continue the system of exploitation. I believe that it will be that kind of clash, but I don't think it will be based on the color of the skin as Elijah Muhammad has taught it." Malcolm also assumed that uncompromising, anti-imperialism embodied by trenchant criticism of the West. The West, interestingly declared, are inextricably tied to, quote, imperialism, colonialism, exploitation, and racism. Malcolm went further, extending his burgeoning anti-imperialism to a searing critique of capitalism, the system undergirding Western imperialism. Malcolm argued, quote, "You can't have capitalism without racism. You can't operate a capitalist system unless you are vulturistic. You can't have a capitalism without racism. You can't operate a capitalist system unless you are vulturistic. You have to have someone else's blood to suck to be a capitalist." Malcolm viewed racist oppression and exploitation of African Americans as deeply entangled with US aggression abroad, and this oppression and exploitation of warmongering were and are products of the capitalist system. On the 50th anniversary of Malcolm's assassination, it bears reflecting on how Martin Luther King moved closer to many of the political positions that Malcolm had adopted and advocated in the last year and a half of his life. Entwined with this rendering of Malcolm X's politics is the construction of a seemingly unbridgeable dichotomy between him and Dr. Martin Luther King, each portrayed as the other's antithesis. King's understanding of the nature of US society moved along the same lines. In the years following his march on Washington, and in a sense, we have this idea of Martin Luther King being transfixed after his August 1963 speech, I Have a Dream. But after that, there's a number of speeches that Martin Luther King delivers in the last year, in 66 and in 67, and so forth in 68, that demonstrates that while he remained committed to nonviolence, and of course Malcolm X, and I haven't mentioned here, did not believe in nonviolence. He believed that if you had faced unrelenting state violence, you had the right to self-defense. And while King maintained a commitment to nonviolence, as we shall see, he began to adopt very similar economic and political critiques that Malcolm X had. So after March on Washington, he augmented his eloquent and poignant I Have a Dream vision with a deepening opposition to Washington's foreign policy and to the economic system that produced aggression abroad and inequality and poverty at home. King opposed the war in Vietnam. His opposition was not simply a powerful moral stance, but one that tied Washington's aggression to a system that produced, maintained, and required great disparities of wealth and power between the privileged few and the disenfranchised vast majority. King observed, and I quote, when machines and computers profit, when machines and computers, profit motives and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, militarism, and economic exploitation are incapable of being conquered. King underscored that while the civil rights movement had won important victories, though these victories could not be permanent as long as the underlying structural roots of inequality, poverty, and racism were not fundamentally altered. In short, capitalism had to be radically transformed. And I encourage people to read David Garrow's Burden of the Cross, which is a very good examination of King's eventual political evolution in the last few years of his life. In the 1967 speech to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, King unequivocally articulated his analysis, and I quote, and it's a long quote, but I think it's very important. One day we must ask the question, why are there 40 million poor people in America? And when you begin to ask that question, you're raising questions about the economic system, about a broader distribution of wealth. When you ask that question, you begin to question the capitalist economy. And I'm simply saying that more and more, we've got to begin to ask questions about the whole society. We are called upon to help to discourage beggars in life's marketplace. But one day we must come to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. It means that questions must be raised. You see, my friends, when you deal with this, you begin to ask the question, who owns the oil? You begin to ask the question, who owns the iron ore? You begin to ask the question, why is it that people have to pay water bills in a world that is 2/3 water? These are questions that must be asked. And of course, and as a side, I remind you of the chairman of Nestle who said that people do not have a fundamental right to water. So King's political practice and strategy reflected his new analytical appreciation of the interconnection of racism, oppression, inequality, and capitalism, echoing Malcolm X. In the last year of his life, he was organizing the Poor People's Campaign, which sought to achieve a fairer and more equitable society through a united movement of black and white workers, all the exploited and oppressed in the United States. While the Poor People's Campaign aimed at peaceful reform, it was a potent challenge to the ideological and ideational hegemony of capitalism. The goal, the promised land of King, and the just society in which African American human rights were respected, of Malcolm X, that goal of Malcolm X, the creation of a better world, one fit for human beings, that has yet to be realized. So while the promised land has yet to be reached, and for some envisioned, the struggle for a better world continues. And I think this ties Malcolm X and Martin Luther King together. And that's one of Malcolm X. This is Malcolm X and Martin Luther King in Washington. And this is a quote from basically from one of his speeches. This one given at the Beyond Witness speech given at Riverside Church. And it's available online.
So we're going to open up the panel for discussion and the floor for any questions that you might have. I find, Dr. Saney, this last quote quite compelling. And the thought that occurred to me as you were completing the quote was the question that I thought I would end on today, but maybe I'll just bring it up now, is, I mean, can you imagine what would have happened if Martin Luther King and Malcolm X had come to their maturity in thinking about these matters together at the same time and dovetail their experience into a phenomenal movement in the United States? I think the civil rights movement in the United States would have had a very different flavor to it, and perhaps the country would be much farther along in, you know, we have a piece of scripture or saying in the Bible, in the Christian Bible, that says, "As iron sharpens iron." And these two men were certainly sharpening each other. And had they been able to come together at the times when they were mobilizing people, it just would have been phenomenal. And it's good to hear. I think many people today are still under the false illusion that they were in such totally opposite camps and that there was no kind of overlap or intersection of ideas. And we hear from you, and we hear from just Malcolm X himself in his work and in Martin's work, how their ideas did start to come together, and they were not in opposite camps. So I thank you for that piece. Some very interesting presentations. I want to thank the panelists, give them thanks. And I want to just start the discussion in picking up on something that Dr. Munro said when we were talking about this whole idea of global white supremacy. And I'm wondering if today, do you think today we should still be using that kind of language, or have we softened it when we think of the concept now of white privilege, and we talk about white privilege today rather than white supremacy, and perhaps that's because people have been rising up and refuse to be dominated. But how do you see these two concepts tying together?
Great question. I think we need them both. I think that the use of white privilege does do some intellectual and ideological work that's useful to think about how someone like myself can walk around in society and take for granted certain things that people of color cannot is definitely a useful kind of concept. But it would be dangerous to move away from the way in which that is, of course, a question of power. And the structures of power that Malcolm X and Dr. King and others were talking about are absolutely essential as well. So I would just simply say that we need both.
Questions from the audience? Anybody have a question? I know in all of this room. Really?
What you said, like,
Okay.
Just to pick up on the note that you were going with, forgive me if I've forgotten your names just now, but if anyone wants to speak to it, I started to read a book called The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander.
Excellent book.
It might be a good way to elaborate on this this obvious problem of white supremacy and show the historical continuity that these global forms of oppression have, so that none of us get deluded into thinking because of mainstream buzzwords and so on that we in any way live in anything close to a just society, whether in the U.S. or Canada. So if you could talk about what the book, if you know about the thesis of the book, or The New Jim Crow, or just what it represents.
Do any of the panel know? Okay.
The prison industrial complex, so to speak.
oh, am I?
Do you want to speak?
Who are you inviting? You want to take it first?
That's a real thing.
Yeah, so for those who haven't read it, The New Jim Crow is really an argument against the prison industrial complex that it is a form of re-enslavement. So for example, after slavery ended, they immediately started using like vagrancy tickets or petty crime to sort of re-imprison people and then use them to labor, so essentially as sharecroppers. So she traces a lot of that history, and then the argument is that the prison system right now is this continuation. I would argue that since we're a surplus population essentially, right? Once slavery ends and black people are no longer functional as field labor, what do you do with us? In essence, we become, for a white supremacist capitalist society, excess property. So the prison system is a soft form of soft genocide essentially, that when 1/3 of our community is removed out into the prison system, when those numbers are growing, it's really, you can't poison gas us, but you can stick us in prison essentially. But to go back to the point about capitalism, obviously the prison system, capitalism, racism intersect, right? If you look at, say, Spring Hill, let's talk about Spring Hill, just got downgraded to a town or whatever. Is it a village now? It was a city and it got downgraded to a town. So Spring Hill, obviously, which used to be part of the mining industry, and they still advertise this, like, as if you're coming to Spring Hill to see the Miners Museum. Everybody's coming to Spring Hill because the prison is there. The only thing that's in Spring Hill is a Tim Hortons and gas stations, because if you're coming and traveling into Spring Hill, you're probably visiting people in the prison. So the entire economic system of Spring Hill is really, the engine of it is people visiting this prison. And so I've always contended that they should just put up a giant sign like welcome families of prisoners, like prison that way, and not pretend the prison doesn't exist. But there's this very bizarre sort of thing when you go into this prison town where everybody knows you're here for the prison, but nobody talks about it. Like if you're there at 12:30 p.m. at the Tim Hortons, you're probably trying to make visiting at 1 p.m. just down the road, but there's this kind of cover-up at the same time as obviously the contracts on the prison, food, the construction on the prison, people working as guards or support staff. So there's nothing. I'm not dogging on Spring Hill. I'm saying that's a very small town. The only thing in there, and the huge economic engine, is the prison. Yet, of course, we pretend it doesn't exist. So, sorry.
No, I was just going to say Michelle Alexander. Yeah. So what I was going to say was what she does in this book is really bring to our attention that with this whole economic benefit of carrying on prisons, that our country is building more and more prisons, and it becomes a way to get free labor. And so when you come out of slavery, this goes back to the talk about not a black and white issue, but an oppressor and oppressed issue. That when we begin to see peoples rise up in the world to say we are speaking out against this imperialistic mindset that says that you get to dominate us, that's what she's trying to speak to. That when slavery was legal in the United States, or when you had free labor, when it was outlawed, you did not. So then what you did was you got people as sharecroppers to sign over themselves to you so that they would have land to farm and a possibility for some food, because suddenly people had no way to get income, and of course we didn't have massa to take care of us anymore. So they signed on sharecroppers. Then when people started to get a little bit more educated, a little bit more independent, the way that you had to put them down was through Jim Crow laws. And so those were instituted, and that kept people oppressed. And that was a way to keep this mass of people in line. And then after Jim Crow laws were challenged in the movement and legislated out of the United States, what way can we subdue black people? And so the way to subdue them was to now come up with these laws on our war against drugs, and now there's a big war against drugs because drugs are running rampant. But the interesting thing that Alexander points out in her book is that when the legislation came down, this whole hard line on the war against drugs were actually moving out. It had subsided. People were not involved in drugs as much. But now you have laws on the books that allow you to lock up brown and black people who are carrying small amounts of drugs on their person or whatever. And so then you start to see this growth in the prison industrial complex. And it was another way to get free labor, because when you're in prison, I can make a contract with some farmer or whatever and get the prisoners to come out and work my field. And now you're just back to slave labor again. And so it's just been growing and growing, and that's what we see. And we see whole towns like Spring Hill, we see it in the United States, whole towns whose total economy depends on the prison that's in that town.
And I would also add, in terms of prison economics, they haven't improved the amount of money that prisoners make per day since the 1980s. So the maximum you can make in a prison right now is $6.90 a day. But that would be the highest jobs. They immediately take 30% off anything you work for, and that goes into the prisoner fund. So when people sit around going, oh, why should they have TV in prison? The cable is paid for by the inmate committee. It's not paid for by taxpayers' money. Your family pays for your TV. So if your family doesn't have it, you ain't getting one. Hopefully your cellmate shares if you have one. But like all the jobs in the prison outside of the admin jobs are done by prisoners. All the cleaning, all the maintenance, all that is done by prisoners. So even within the prison, there's a huge amount of labor. The ranges aren't cleaned if the inmates don't do it. And that's always like, for example, in Burnside, one of the contentious issues in lockdown is people go on what is essentially strikes. So in the last big lockdown in Burnside, they were refusing to do the laundry because it was the inmates on the lockdown range. And they're getting shit bombed nonstop, essentially. So they were like, we're not working anymore. The laundry stopped getting done, and that was one of the precipitations for this lockdown that nobody talks about. So I think it's also important to acknowledge within the prison, they have 59-cent, not for resale pop that's resold for $2 in the prison. So you also see an economy within that, medications trade, all that. So I think, in terms of also thinking about the labor in the prison, people don't think that, and people tend to think we're supporting these people and why should they sit around doing X, Y, Z, and they're not. They're working for a maximum of $6.90 a day, which hasn't been updated.
Yeah, and that's the way that some of it runs now. But as you know, in the old days, and maybe in some parts of the United States today, they actually go out and work outside of the prison. In minimal security prisons, they go outside and they work for people free. So it is still slave labor. So that's an interesting point with Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow is the name of the book for anybody who's interested. It is a really interesting read on this whole idea of the way that you keep a people oppressed. And to think that Malcolm X, Malik El-Shabazz had this vision or this wisdom in the 60s about this whole idea of keeping people oppressed and the way that you can overcome that oppression is remarkable to me. This is a long fought battle. And one of the things that he mentions in his autobiography on page 382, I'm just going to read it and ask the panel to comment on it. He says, I kept having all kinds of troubles trying to develop the kind of black nationalist organization I wanted to build for the American Negro. Why black nationalism? Well, in a competitive American society, how can there ever be any white-black solidarity before there is some black solidarity? Any comments on that?
First I'd say that Malcolm in many ways is drawing on a long tradition within the black liberation movement of the idea of first that people of African descent, at least people within the United States, have to be able to organize and unite first before they can engage with other groups. And it sort of reminds me in a way it's an echo, probably not a deliberate echo, but an echo of the idea of self-determination. That self-determination has to be exercised first by an oppressed nation. Some of you might not be aware that basically there was something called a Black Belt thesis, which was about self-determination of African American southern communities. This was during the 20s and the 30s. It was a thesis that was advanced, for example, by the Communist Party of the United States. We can get into debate about how much did they really support, how much did they not support it, but this is a very, very, very essential idea. But within all of this as well, in terms of dealing with the global system of white supremacy, how Malcolm in advancing from a simply race-senseless position was rooting white supremacy clearly within the operation of capitalism and imperialism. And that in order to challenge white supremacy, you needed to basically overthrow these systems. But within that, the struggle of African Americans, for example, as a separate sector, as a separate people, as a separate nation, whichever term you wish to use, and all those can be debated, was this issue that African Americans have to unite first. And one of the things we have here in Nova Scotia, because you're in the North Branch Library, and on November 30th, 1968, the largest black political meeting in Canada to that date took place here. And out of that came the Black United Front. And this debate over what exactly led to the emergence of the Black United Front. But that mass democratic meeting of the black community was part and parcel of this idea that before the black community could unite with other groups and engage in a joint struggle, it had to sort out its own problems, and it had to achieve unity, and particularly organizational unity, because Malcolm X always emphasized the need for organization. It was a difficult thing, but that's why he formed the Organization of Afro-American Unity, the need to get organized.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to also say that at the same time, Malcolm X had this he started the Organization of Afro-American Unity, at the same time to galvanize and mobilize African American people. But at the same time, he had stepped into this international role and had this. He was hugely influenced by the Pan-African movement. In fact, he patterned the Organization of Afro-American Unity after the OAU, Organization of African Unity, and said, yeah, well, the headquarters or the first branch, in fact, the first branch of the Organization of Afro-American Unity was in Ghana. It was when he went to Ghana that the idea came to fruition. Well, one could say it was in New York, but he said, the first chapter is here in Ghana. And he also said, and we're going to have, chapters in the Caribbean, in South America, wherever there were people of African descent. So he was hugely influenced by what was happening on the African continent in terms of decolonization, and also in Asia in terms of decolonization in Asia and the Caribbean and Latin America. So it was these two things going on at the same time. It was almost as if he knew his time was short and was doing everything at the same time. So it was not just a focus on the United States, but in addition, also Canada. You also mentioned Canada. In addition to this global perspective, because I think it was John who said, what's happening in Mississippi, if you can understand what's happening in Mississippi, if you understand what's happening in the Congo. Mm-hmm. So just hugely global perspective. When Malcolm departed from the Nation of Islam at the end of 1963, he founded the Organization of Afro-American Unity and also the Muslim Mosque. Mm-hmm. Right?
Mm-hmm. A hand up back here.
Did somebody at the back? Can you stand up? Can people stand up?
Somebody in the front.
That's
And Rhonda, you got somebody in the front.
Fatima at the back. Okay, just shout out your question. Okay, so the question is Malcolm X, Islam and?
And Islamophobia?
Terrorism and Islam.
How does Malcolm X sort of inform what we should be doing today about terrorism and Islamophobia?
Okay, so I can start off. I would say, so the question is for people who didn't hear Malcolm X, Islam, Islamophobia today, terrorism, and how Malcolm X would, what kind of advice Malcolm X would give to people today. So I would say one of the things we know about Malik Shabazz is just he was fierce, and he was unafraid, and he spoke his mind. I think that's one that didn't endear him to a lot of people, black or white or whomever, because he spoke what he felt, and was clearly against all forms of repression. Interestingly, even though at that time, the New York Times and CBS, I think the journalist Mike Wallace had done a piece on Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, which wasn't very flattering. One could say it was Islamophobic. But at that time, the kind of Islamophobia we're experiencing today is worse than what Malcolm X, Sunni Muslims or Nation of Islam Muslims were experiencing at the time. The Nation of Islam was seen as a kind of, even though they were a conservative organization, they were seen as by the powers that be as a radical kind of black, militant, hate white people organization. So they were always presented in that light. The kind of deliberate Islamophobia that we see today that's fostered by the media, by academia, by the state, and other groups is just unprecedented. And I think Malcolm X I know Malcolm X would have fought against that. I know Malcolm X would have spoken fearlessly. I know Malcolm X would have taken on some of the powers, some of the people who are stoking this Islamophobia. I mean, Muslims are being killed, are being attacked in the United States and in Canada. Mosques are being burnt down and people are throwing pig head in mosques and so on. So what's interesting too is that certain black groups or black consciousness groups, if you want to call it that, would take this one part of Malcolm X, the black nationalist part, and this was the thesis of my paper, and not the other part of him as a Muslim. So if we can, Malcolm X, as everybody here has shown on this panel, his wide vision, his support for what's happening in Vietnam and Algeria and so on. So I think what the international or the American or North American Muslim community is actually looking for is support from black groups too and other groups, and saying, hey, you cannot stand by and let this thing happen because of your own Islamophobia, right? Because we have this thinking that the black community by default is a Christian community, which is true and is not true at the same time. So to have other groups stand back and watch the marginalization of Muslims being cast out of Western society in some vicious ways, Malcolm X certainly would not stand for it, as the examples in his own life reveal.
And I think that also what his life shows us is how wayward we go when we are not educated, when we don't understand. And this is a tendency among human beings. We fear the unknown and we immediately discard it, and not only that, sometimes viciously attack, right, in our ignorance. And so even for Malcolm X, he learned a completely different lesson about Islam and what it means to belong to the Nation of Islam when he made his Hajj. When he went on that pilgrimage and saw the people that he encountered, and he says at one point that he is with the I can't think of his name now, who hosted him actually when he was caught at the airport and they wouldn't let him go to Mecca. This man that he had met in the United States and had his card or something, and had his phone number, he called them, they came to get him, they took him home, and he's talking to him, and he's talking to him in a very fatherly way, and he says, and he just couldn't feel like he was with a white man at all. And it's really interesting the way that he phrases that. I didn't feel that he was white, or I didn't feel like I was in the presence of a white person. And I'm saying, how does that feel? But anyway, but what he meant was there was no racial divide, no racial tension, and he was now beginning to be exposed to a different understanding, so that even his own hatred of whites was informed by this trip to say, it's not white people, because here, people of all different colors are coming together and they're united, right? We're all worshiping together and we don't feel this tension. It's love all around and everybody is considerate and loving of the other. And so we come to understand that when we see things, when we really understand the truth about things, and he calls it truth over and over. This experience was truth for him. That he understood that some of the things that he had been espousing were wrong, right? And so it starts with education. It starts with us continuously educating people to say, this is not Islam. This phobia that's going around is not Islam. I mean, as far as Islamic people standing up and saying it is one thing, but everybody else has to stand and say it. This is not acceptable treatment of people because you have some extreme group that's doing something that does not agree with the teachings of this faith, right? This is not who we really are. And it's up to us to stand up. It means so much more when somebody who's not, of us stands up on our behalf and says, this is not the truth. And so I think we all need to educate ourselves and understand that this is not the truth that's being put out. Media has its own agenda. Always remember that.
And on that point, there's actually a speech that Malcolm X gives in Harvard where he talks about disinformation. He doesn't use the word disinformation, but he talks about specifically how the media, the monopoly media, the capitalist media, the corporate media, creates certain images of Africa and so forth. And one of the things I think he would point out, I mean, obviously with our recent act, I'm talking about terrorism, and our recent so-called terrorism, on our recent incident here in Halifax, where apparently to be a terrorist, according to the Harper government, you have to be Muslim. Neo-Nazis do not commit terror. Okay? So, you know, a bunch of neo-Nazis get together, decide to kill a bunch of people, and maybe actually carry it out. Who knows? That's not terrorism. Only terrorism has now been equated with Islam. And what Malcolm would say, I think, is what is an Arab. What he would say is that those who are portrayed as being the purveyors of violence and terrorism are often the victims of terrorism. And he always focused, when he was talking, for example, about the Congo, and Malcolm was one of the first people to raise the issue of what happened to Patrice Lumumba, right? And the role of the United States, the role of the UN Security Council, the role of Belgium and so forth, was to basically focus on the state, in a sense, as being the major purveyor of violence and terrorism and so forth. But he also focused, and I think important that Reverend Dr. Britton was speaking about, was education. But that education had to be directed and organized to challenge the disinformation. And Malcolm X, you know, as Dr. Kubo was pointing out, when he ran the New York Mosque and he was taking people to planetariums and to museums and so forth, he was about study. He was about, basically taking a matter, taking an issue and studying it in detail and so forth. The same thing when you read the speech he gives in Harvard, and I'm actually looking for it in here, he talks about in detail how the media constructs this world of disinformation, and then how that disinformation, once it takes a grip of people's minds, is then used against those self-same people's interests, but to promote this ongoing agenda of violence by the state and so forth. So I think he will be taking a very powerful stand here today, and he'll be challenging these people who claim to be the greatest anti-terrorists on the planet, but who are indeed the greatest terrorists.
I have a question right in front here.
Yeah, we've got another one in the back there too.
As I listen to Al talk about the planned isolation of prisoners, black prisoners from families, from literature, from telephone calls, I thought, where have I heard this before? Where have I heard? And it's the Truth and Reconciliation and Residential School story from one end to the other, for which the committee and government has apologized. But have you drawn that same parallel?
Yeah, well, I think also that we tend to, and one of the things that's triangulated is the Indigenous experience from the Black experience. So one of the ways that Canada sort of ignores the Black presence is to not connect the Black experience to colonialism, to what is happening to Indigenous people. So, for example, Maclean's just did this, most racist city in Canada. I'm originally from Winnipeg. I have no doubt about Winnipeg's racism, but how can you evaluate the difference between anti-Black racism in Nova Scotia and anti-Indigenous racism in Winnipeg? What's worse? There is no worse. So even that kind of act is about privileging certain understandings of racism in order to divide and rule Indigenous people from Black people. So absolutely, yes, through the experience of colonialism, Indigenous and Black people who also share within prison some of the same experiences. But I would say that absolutely, yes, it's similar to the residential experience. And also the reason why we don't make those connections is because there's a very concerted effort in Canada to erase the Black presence and then to use the Indigenous presence in particular ways, all to deny the experience of colonialism.
Another question here.
Okay, right here.
About 2 or 3 questions.
So here's this way at the back.
Says where?
Jackie, but this gentleman was first. Yeah, go ahead.
On this point that Dr. Saney raised about the Malcolm as one of the early exposers of the mechanism of disinformation regarding the violence of the state. It was in Thanksgiving, American Thanksgiving, either 1962 or 63. Malcolm X was with a group of young people, somewhere in the northeastern United States. And he gave a talk, and somewhere at some point in the talk, he said, we never landed on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock landed on us. I think that's right to the end.
Was it Jackie?
Where?
Who? Oh,
No,
say-
this is where they're Jackie.
Okay.
I have a question. It's not going to be easy for me to come out with it, but hopefully it will make sense. The Book of Negroes is quite kind. And in watching it, I realized that two of the principals in that movie, Aminata and Munro, do not have African names, but Arabic names.
They're Muslims.
And that speaks to the fact that long before the transatlantic slave trade or slavery, my ancestors had been enslaved and, in a sense, still continue to be enslaved by the Arabs. Now, my difficulty in existing in today's world is trying to negotiate the world from a heritage of 14 centuries of slavery. And I found it useful to be guided by two philosophies. One is PanAfricanism, the other is Afrocentricity. In terms of Pan-Africanism, I am awed by Marcus Garvey. He's my hero. In terms of Afrocentricity, it is Molefi Asanti. He can do no wrong. Now,
Well,
in terms of trying to position two people that have been highlighted to be Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, I have difficulty in understanding them from those two perspectives. And maybe the panelists can assist me in trying to see them from those vantage points.
From the vantage point of Pan-Africanism and Afrocentricity?
Afrocentricity, yes.
Okay.
I'd like to say, like, you've been very controversial, and I think, given what I've gone through, I think in the last little while, I think I can give it a lot of leeway. I think, Marcus Garvey and Molefi Asanti, and I'll say this quite bluntly, Marcus Garvey built an international mass movement. And Marcus Garvey himself is actually, if you actually read and even read Tony Martin's biography of Garvey, his first, Marcus Garvey had a very profound admiration, specifically for Lenin. Okay, and you actually read that when he actually sends a Lenin. I mean, you don't have to agree with communism, socialism, but it shows that while Garvey was focused on the liberation of people of African descent, first and foremost, okay, he also understood that the impact of, for example, of the Russian Revolution and so forth. Molefi Asanti, let's deal with Molefi Asanti. Well, let's even deal with a little more historical here. Malcolm X is really the intellectual heir of either the radicalization of the civil rights movement or the Black Power, Black liberation struggle of the 60s, however you want to look at it, right? The Black Panther Party, Republic of New Africa, all of these organizations that come out in the 60s and 70s and so forth, draw their inspiration from Malcolm X, right? And Malcolm X himself, while being first and foremost committed to Black liberation, saw it within the context of an international struggle. We may disagree with that, but the reason he saw it in that sense was he also understood, for example, that unlike Asanti, who does not engage in a critique of capitalism and imperialism, okay, Malcolm X did engage in that. And the Black Panther Party used to refer to people like, in one of Molefi Asanti's intellectual progenitors, so to speak, is Malawi Karanga, who was part of us, United Slaves. And they were manipulated, I mean, it's a whole debate, by the FBI to kill Black Panther Party members. And so on. And the party members used to refer to these guys as pork chop nationalists. They refer to cultural nationalists. So this whole issue, I think, when we get into some of these questions of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, is they try to understand the material roots of racism, of Black subordination, Black domination, and so forth. And I think within all of this stuff, when we look at Marcus Garvey is much more sophisticated as a thinker, okay, than people make him out to. Yes, he was, we talk about his Back to Africa, we talked United Improvement Association, the largest international black mass movement ever, but he was a little more sophisticated, and he actually gave speeches against capitalism. And when he went back to Jamaica, after he had been exiled from the United States, he was trying to organize workers as well and so forth. So I think, there's a much more sophisticated and nuanced Garvey intellectual tradition, right? That, in a sense, I'm not saying he's a socialist, okay? I'm not saying that, I would not say Malcolm X was a socialist, Okay, but because we don't know where his evolution will take him. But he was also a person who's going to be engaging intellectually with some of these profound issues that I don't think Molefi Asanti has, right? And Pan-Africanism itself, when we look at Du Bois, for example, we look at Walter Rodney, okay, we look at Frantz Fanon and so forth, people who begin to take up this issue of the socio-economic structures, right, that undergird white supremacy and so forth, and inevitably leads them to a critique of capitalism and imperialism. Asante has not gone there.
Well, if I can just thank you very much, but you haven't answered my question. Maybe I didn't phrase the question properly. Would you call Malcolm X an Afrocentric? Would you call him a Pan-Africanist? The same for Martin Luther King. Would you call Martin Luther King?
No, but I think that question comes up. Like Afrocentric.
It depends on.
Well, it depends on your definition of
Pan-African.
Afrocentricity. I mean, Afrocentricity, a common definition, is putting Africa first, right? Putting Africa at the center, looking at knowledge or whatever else through the perspective, through the lens of African-centered. So that's a simple definition of Pan-Africanism. So yes, I would call Malcolm X a Pan-Africanist and an Afrocentric person. And the same thing for Dr. King. Yeah.
I think it's also, I mean, the contention, the definition of Afrocentricity is if we mean exactly as we're saying, putting people at the center, or if we mean the state-focused. So, and this is kind of Isaac's point. Sorianto's recently at Temple with Dr. Asanti. Montero, who's been a major community leader at Temple, who was very heavily involved in organizing for Mumia, for example, and he was denied his tenure and dismissed from his job. And it turned out Asanti had gone to the dean and was very much part of removing him. And when Asanti was sort of called out for this, he said that communism was, this kind of